Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternate. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
It's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes says,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
Hello there. I hope you are all staying warm wherever you may be. As is my good or bad luck, depending on how you look at it, as a citizen/denizen of Chicago, I am mighty cold. Sitting here, as you know, in Hoth 2.0. A lot of love out there to the Star Wars universe as a ghetto nerd. I'm going to skip right to the chase. Not a lot of appetizer being opened up for this episode of the Chauncey DeVega Show. You can hear I'm excited. I'm happy. These internets are really, really amazing. It is a wonderful thing when you can reach out to someone who you are a fan of. In this case, he who is the man, the one and only Joe Lansdale. I hinted and alluded to and previewed this conversation on the last episode of the Chauncey DeVega Show, where I was lucky enough to talk to the one and only April Parker Jones. Cool folk from Jericho fame, one of my favorite TV shows in recent memory. And of course, from the great show on the Oprah Winfrey Network, If Loving You Is Wrong. So Joe Lansdale and I talked about a week or so ago. He is the gentleman who has written so many things. I mean, he really doesn't need any introduction. Bubba Ho-Tep, Cold in July, based on the book/novella of the same name. The Hap and Leonard stories, which if you are not reading Hap and Leonard, you need to. A new story just came out in that installment. Can't go wrong with Hap and Leonard. And in this conversation, because we don't do interviews here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, we have conversations. I use the analogy or the metaphor of, imagine you got the cool Cadillac. You pull up to a friend's house. He says, meet me here. We're going to go for a ride. And in this case, Mr. Joe Lansdale said, Chauncey, you need to scoot over to the passenger seat because I'm going to be driving this car. And you know what? When you have a great talent like Mr. Joe Lansdale saying, hey, I'm driving the Cadillac, I'm taking it around on the grand tour, you sit down and you listen and you enjoy the storytelling. So Joe and I talk about his TV work. We talk about his upcoming work based on his great story, The Bottoms. We talk about Hap and Leonard, which is going to be a TV series. We talk about how, in God's name, did the wonderful movie Bubba Ho-Tep ever get made. If you have not seen Bubba Ho-Tep, that is your assignment for today. Go see Bubba Ho-Tep. If you have not watched Cold in July, which is now on cable, do check it out. A wonderful story about bad men, about domestic life, about opening your eyes to the world around you. So much stuff going on there. Fathers and sons. And I asked Mr. Lansdale, I'm doing a lot of thinking about these questions about masculinity and identity and race and gender, all that good stuff. It's so cool when you can actually talk to somebody who's made a movie that you really like. So that was awesome. And there's a point in the conversation you're going to hear where sometimes it's just easy to talk to somebody and you realize that you are fellow travelers. So Mr. Lansdale and I, we go down that road. We talk about race. We talk about identity. We talk about politics. We talk about the Old West. We talk about cowboys. We talk about great mythic/real figures like the one and only Deadwood Dick/Nat Love or Nate Love. And this was just a wonderful, wonderful conversation made possible by the wonders of the internet. I quite literally, as a fan, said, you know what? We got 3 seasons done on the podcast. My rule is you make a list of people you want to talk to. And sometimes you just are blessed by fate and time. I sent him an email. He immediately responded, said, Chauncey, let's sit down. Let's chop it up. Let's make it happen. The format sounds cool. And that's what we do here. My mission here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, the podcast, the eponymous podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show, is just to bring smart and interesting people with smart and interesting things to say and sit them down and we have a wonderful conversation. And I know that we're all going to learn from this. And it's also really inspirational because, you know, as much as sometimes I can be a Luddite who sits down on the porch, drinking my Lynchburg lemonade with my walking stick in my hand, yelling at the youngsters about Twitter and Instagram and all their trouble with this technology. Well, technology sometimes makes wonderful things happen. So this was just a great conversation. As I said, I'm getting right to the point, minimizing the appetizer, getting right to the meal. And of course, a nice, interesting update. This will be the first podcast episode for the Chauncey DeVega Show that you can hear on Stitcher and on iTunes. Finally, they were taking forever to approve this show. And I was like, maybe something's wrong. Maybe they're going to send me an email say resubmit it. But we finally got that figured out, so that'll make us even easier to find. So after my great conversation with the one and only Champion Joe, the one and only Mr. Joe Lansdale of Bubba Ho-Tep and Cold in July fame, we will talk about the new ways to find us, in addition to ChaunceyDeVega.com. And I'll also give you my Oscar preview and share a recipe very quickly about what I'm going to be eating, because I love the Oscars. I love sitting down and watching for 4 hours to see if the host messed up. I love the pomp and circumstance, and yes, I clap, I stand up, and sometimes I cry when they do that montage of all the folks we have lost in the previous year. So, cutting to the chase, to the wick, to the white part of the meat, with no further ado, the one and only Mr. Joe Lansdale. It was a pleasure, and I think you're going to enjoy the conversation.
Chauncey, how are you, man?
Yeah, it's a small world, and folks always try to find some, they make up some sort of lead when they talk to somebody, but this is, real stuff here. So one of my friends actually taught down in Nacogdoches at the local university.
Oh, really? I teach there from time to time.
Yeah, and I was mentioning to him when I first discovered your work about 2 years ago, I was like, yeah, I discovered this great author, Joe Lansdale, and he's like, oh, I see him at the coffee shop on campus. And I was like, the world really is that small. What do you teach down there?
I used to teach either, a couple of semesters or one semester with the understanding that I had to sometimes go off to Europe or go do other things, and they were really nice about it. And I became their writer in residence. I guess I taught there regularly for about 7 years, and the last 3 years I've had so much stuff going on in film and travel that I just said, you know what, I'm going to have to take a little hiatus, here. I taught screenplay writing, and then I taught short story writing sometimes. I taught comic book writing once. I taught novel writing, I think once or twice. Mostly I taught short story writing, though, and really, really enjoyed doing it.
I mean, is there a standard, approach to teaching undergrads or people in an MFA program screenplay writing? Does everybody teach the same stuff?
Mine was based on the fact that I don't have a degree. I have 15 sold screenplays, even though none of them have ever been made except the animated film stuff I wrote. But I sold them to Ridley Scott, John Irving, etc. And so I had the credentials. And then as a teacher of short stories and novels, of course, I've written a lot of novels and a lot of short stories.
It's funny, the folks I know, the few acquaintances I have who've worked in Hollywood who've actually sold screenplays or actually worked on film, it's like this really interesting divergence because the folks I know who actually do it, many of them say going to like an MFA program for writing or going to film school is a waste of time except for the networking.
I agree with
And I know all these folks who teach in the programs who've never made anything. So it's always for me, it's like, you've never done it, so how can you teach it?
Yeah, I think there's a certain truth to that. I won't say that's an absolute, because the ones that I have the most trouble with are the people who teach absolutely from no experience other than their own classroom experience. And sometimes you'll have somebody that's a gifted teacher that can't do it. They used to have the old thing, those who can do and those who can't teach. I don't believe that's absolute, but it's pretty damn close, I've had martial arts instructors who weren't as good at martial arts as some other people that I was working out with, but they could teach better. They could bring ideas forward, but at least they knew they had the tools. They had done it at least to some degree. And I think writing is like that too. And just because you are a writer doesn't mean that you're a good teacher. Not everyone can transfer their ideas and the understanding of it to the students. And I'm not what you would call a line-by-line teacher. I tend to teach in more a broader method. I try to teach, are you telling a good story? And in screenplays, I try to say, well, you need to let people know if this is inside or outside. But even there, I think screenplay writing unto itself should be flexible, too. And there are, it's gotten to where that everybody writes a screenplay almost the same way. It used to not be that way. When I wrote my first screenplay, I'd never seen one before, and I just guessed at it, and I optioned that damn thing 11 times, before I finally sold it for quite a bit of money.
It's funny, what's that other old expression? I can't teach you how to run fast. Some people just have that intangible, and they can work on the mechanics and all this other stuff, but if you don't have a good idea, and if you ain't got it, you just ain't got it.
No, you hadn't got it. I think you can give people tools to help them write better, but they have to have some core energy there or design. And I don't think people are born to be writers, because obviously writing is a man-made art. It's a human-made art, I think is probably fairer to say. And it hasn't been around as long as humans have been. So that's something that we created, but it comes out of the same energy, the same well of creativity that all forms of art an expression come out of it. It's like nobody's born to be a director, because there were no such thing as film directors until, film was invented. And then the methodology of it has changed, but that creative impulse is there, and some people can learn to do it mechanically enough to do it, but then there are those who seem to have a natural inclination towards creativity, and then if they're given that particular tool, or that somehow their life experience directs them toward some particular art, then, it depends then on how much creativity that they have as to what kind of results they get.
I went to WorldCon here in Chicago, World Science Fiction Convention, and I think it was like the 70th one there, and I went to some workshops.
Yeah.
And I always forget the gentleman's name. I think it's Jack McDivitt. He's written like 50
yeah,
different
I've
books.
Heard of him. Sure, I know who Jack is. I've read some of his stuff, sure.
Yeah, prolific author, and he was doing a workshop for writers. And I was like, anytime you get a chance to learn from somebody, you sit in, I'm sitting here and as a journeyman writer, so I'm going to learn some things. So I'm sitting there, and he says, the vast majority of you in here, and most of you do not have a story to tell.
Yeah, well, he's right. I mean, that's a sad truth. It really is. I mean, I understood the concept and had a certain ability to tell stories before I had a certain style and a certain mechanical understanding of how to put it on the paper. But I knew almost, I don't want to say instinctively, because I'm not a big believer in instincts for things that are like I said, human made. But I think creativity is something that you're born with, and that maybe everybody has it to some degree, but that some people have it to a greater degree, and that by environmental circumstances it's fed more. It's like putting fuel in an oven that's already there, and you're just heated up, But I think that most people, and this is true of the classes that I've taught, is that most of those people, no matter how earnest they are, will never be able to do it because they don't have the will, they don't have the talent, they don't have the design, and they don't know what a story is when they see it. And they also, I think you can do the opposite, though, too, is you can worry so hard about having an original idea that you can end up constipating your mind, because it's not always an original idea. It's the way you tell it. And most great storytellers are telling stories that people have told before, but they're telling them in their own unique and personal way. And I think that's what defines a storyteller. And a professional storyteller or a professional writer should be able to write something that's magnificent and artistic, and then on any given day should be able to be like a carpenter and build a good chair, meaning that you should be able to tell a good, solid story at any time, even if it's not something that's going to knock it out of the park that time. People, if they pick it up, they go, okay, I got a good story from that person. But also, if they're a really good writer, that means as they go on, that most of the time they're going to hit it a little higher than that, and sometimes they're going to knock it completely out of the park. But there's going to be a level, a standard by which they do not fall below, that they always maintain that. At their worst, they're going to be professional.
And you're down there in Texas, and I don't know, when you were growing up, if you followed professional wrestling. I'm still a huge professional wrestling fan. And
my dad was a wrestler. He was 40-something when I was born. He fought in fairs before there was professional wrestling. He's one of those guys that, in a sense, helped create professional wrestling before it was professional. He fought in fairs, and he did it. They didn't have a winner that was, planned. He was a shooter a lot of times, but what he would do is that he would go to these fairs and they would offer a prize for whoever could stay in the ring with whoever they had, their local guy or the guy that they brought around with them with the carnival. And my dad won a lot of these things. And so he was there at the roots of that. Now, he was a big fan of professional wrestling. I have to admit, I never was. I like the real stuff. And my dad, and when I say real stuff, I don't mean college wrestling. I meant most of these guys are really great athletes and are very, very strong, but they don't know a wrist lock from a wristwatch. And my dad he really did know those things. He knew how to do leg locks, arm locks. He knew a little jiu-jitsu that he had just picked up just from being, he rode the rails from town to town to fight in these damn fairs and carnivals. And this is before I was born. This is when he was with my mother when they first married. My brother, for example, he's 17 years older than me. So by the time I was old enough to kind of know what was going on, he was in his 50s, and he started teaching me, and I was 11. So I come through wrestling in a slightly different at a slightly different age.
Smiling here because the universe is so small and you learn things about people, and it sort of explains why you're attracted to their work, you know? So I had no idea about your father being a professional wrestler, and I was saying, you know, you're down there in Von Erich country. You know, they were legends in the, you know, the whole family in the 70s and the 80s.
Absolutely.
Like rock stars. And
my dad loved all of them.
Yeah, and then you were mentioning the thing about writing and storytelling. You know, Shakespeare talked about, you know, comedy, drama, and tragedy. Or you can even think about wrestling, and I always tell folks, they're like, why have you watched wrestling your whole life? I was like, first of all, my grandmother watched it, my dad, and it's a family tradition. I've loved the business. But I try to explain to folks, like, when you watch wrestling, you're not seeing anything you have not seen before. It's like a soap opera. So in the same sense of the storytelling with writing, you've seen some of these stories before. If it's the genre, you know the rules, but it's what a real craftsperson does with those rules that makes it a great story.
A professional wrestling, it's kind of like broad soap operas with sweat. I mean, you know, it had the villains and it had the good guys. And, you know, I remember Haystack Calhoun and all of those. That was the era when I watched it, you know, because I watched it with my dad. I never became a big fan of it, not because I thought it was a, you know, bad thing, but although I felt like that their insistence that it was real was a little bit, you know, aggravating. But that was not to say that they themselves weren't, you know, athletes, but the fact that, oh yeah, this is real seemed a little stretching it a little far because it was pretty obvious.
Yeah, kayfabe. You had to protect the business.
But the thing that I always liked was that, and when you go back to those guys, they were still doing real wrestling techniques a lot, and some of those guys really did know what kind of things worked in well, that would actually be a technique that you might use in self-defense, for example. But then again, it was a show. It was an excitement. And my dad, when he had done that, it was pretty much you went in and whoever won that match because they whipped your ass. And so he had come from that, and that's what intrigued me more. And I was much more interested in that. My dad was a boxer, too. He did some bare-knuckle stuff, but he was, he had fought in fairs and things like that, Tank Town, and he was quite good at all that stuff. He was not as finesse as I learned from other people and learned from other things, but my base interest in those arts and that my base understanding of wrestling and boxing came from my father, and then I tried to refine it from there, but he was very good. But he also was abnormally strong, and he was a guy with bust belts with his chest and bend, you know, quarters or $half, whatever it was, and put an apple in his hand, squeeze it till it burst, and he could take a piece of metal, a tire tool, it looked like, and just bend the damn thing. And, he would just like start going out and bend it, tear big phone books in half. So he knew a combination of those tricks that are involved in making those things easier to do, but he was also just phenomenally strong. People that knew him to this day talk about, he was like fucking Doc Savage, you know. The guy was unbelievably strong.
Wow.
He was not a big man. He was about 5'8", 5'9", and as he got older, he got very heavy, got kind of fat, but he was real strong, and even as an old man. And his arms were strong, his chest was strong, but he would have trouble when he got old lifting certain things. And I asked him, I said, "Boy, Dad, I know your arms are strong." He said, "Yeah." But he said, "What happens, son, is when you get older and you've been through what I've been through, it's hard to put it all together." And as I've gotten older, I understand that, though my lifestyle's different and I've taken better care of myself than my father, and we're in a different time when medicine and our awareness of things and our food we eat is a lot healthier, and we understand those things. And, and I know how it is to fight weight. As I've gotten older, I'm always fighting weight. That's just part of the problem. But I look at my dad and I think about the fact that he was so strong and that he was able to do all this stuff, that he didn't have to have the kind of finesse that I had to have to make those techniques work, which influenced my understanding of martial arts when I went into judo and things like that, because I was not a little guy, I was not a big guy. So I was in that middle range, and I had to find ways to do things more efficiently and effectively. And so, but still, I couldn't have done that without that base work, that things that I learned from him, which he in turn learned from the carnivals and from wrestlers and from bits of jiu-jitsu that he picked up. So the roots are always there, and it's the same way in writing. And that's what people forget, that you're always standing on the shoulders of someone else who has gone before. So before you get too high and mighty with yourself, and even if you're superior to those people you learned it from, that's because you had them to step on to move up. They were there first. They opened that door. And so to me, I always think of martial arts and writing and is very similar, because martial arts is very creative, and not only in practice but in self-defense and in real situations. You have to be instantly creative. And so to me, that the same impulse is there, and I think that's why I was interested in martial arts, but never had any interest in football or basketball or anything like that. I didn't like team sports. I liked those individual sports, and it was harder to be more individual than boxing, wrestling, or martial arts, although I actually consider them all martial arts.
So thinking about, you have the martial arts, you have the writing, you have the comics. I mean, you're prolific, to be frank, in terms of sort of your reach and your grasp, and you have this, really cool, wonderful, organic creativity to your work. When you talk to folk about all the different things you've done in terms of writing and craft, what do you think are some of the common mistakes people make? Be it writing, a comic book, be it going into martial arts, be it writing traditional prose. Is it just a lot of folk are afraid to conquer the page, or afraid to fail, or they just talk themselves out of things so they never try?
That's a tough one, man. I mean, I wish I had the absolute answer there. If I did, I could go into my class and tell them the first day, and we could all do it. But I know what you're saying. I think that the biggest thing that I find is fear of failure. One of the things you mentioned is a biggie, and I don't think that's just writing. I think that's, constant. I think that's in everything. I always tell people that say, well, I can't find time to write, and I can't. And, I'm sure there's always the exception. Somebody's life is so hard and so miserable that they can't. But I've known people who, under the most dire of circumstances, have done it. And I've known people who had all the time in the world sit around with their thumb up their ass. And what I generally find is that a person can find plenty of time to watch some shitty TV show, or sit around and talk on the phone for 3 hours with somebody down the street, or buy a 12-pack and sit there and drink that. But they can't find 15 minutes to an hour to 2 hours, and yet they can go to a job daily that they hate and show up and be there on time and do it as well as they can, or, at least many people, or even a job they don't hate but they just tolerate, but they can't find the time. And I'm talking about people who claim to want to do this. Obviously not everybody wants to do it. I'm merely talking about those people who are constantly saying they want to write, they don't have time, etc. It's because they don't really want to do it. And so I always tell people, look, if you find it that hard, please don't do it, because you're just wasting your time and you're wasting our time. And if you actually put that shit out there, then somebody might try to read it, and you're just distracting from those people who really want to do it. That doesn't mean everybody is going to be a genius that does it, and it's just not that way. But if you tell a story as passionately as you can, with as much enthusiasm and heart as you can, you're more likely to tell something that people are going to want.
And I was thinking about how I discovered your own books, right? So, discovered the Hap and Leonard series, and then I saw a commercial. You were just at that theater, at the Landmark Theater here in Chicago, with your new movie. So I saw Cold in July at the Landmark. I didn't know that you had written the novel Cold in July, or the novella. Right. So I'm sitting there, and then I'm thinking to myself, so I went home, did a little more research, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is Joe Lansdale's project. And then reading your bio again, because at this point I just like the Hap and Leonard stories. I was like, let me just finish some of these. I'd read 3 or 4 of them. And then I realized that you had done Bubba Ho-Tep. Yep. So in terms of like wonder and discovery, is there such a thing as like the Lansdale universe? What's the connective tissue where somebody could sit there and read your stuff and say, yeah, he wrote this?
Well, I think that the way it's written is the main connective tissue. I mean, I somewhat vary my style and approach, but generally there's a voice and an attitude that's mine, that's fairly identifiable from one project to another. And there are a few exceptions, but generally, if you pick up something of mine, no matter if it's crime, if it's horror, if it's suspense, if it's mainstream, if it's literary, whatever it is, there's a certain voice there that I think that I maintain, even when I'm not, aware of it, because I don't try to do it. And it's also, I think, for me, when I tell a story, when I'm at my best, is that the story is leading me. I'm not leading the story. And that thing just pulls me along. And it's that sense of discovery and that sense of wonder. I don't want to write if I can't find the same excitement I found as a kid when I would read a story or a comic book or watch even a movie, which is also very influential on my work. Any of those things, it was that wonder of discovery and that magic. Not something that was, that you could see every hammer blow and every nail in place. And I also felt that when I was writing, that when it began to work for me and I began to do better work, and I can tell, too, that now occasionally I'll write a story that's a little bit more of, like I said before, building a chair. I can see all of the nails, and I try to smooth it over and make it as good as I can, because I never do anything, you know, just for the hell of it. I'm always trying to be in love with it. Sometimes it just doesn't work as well. But most of the time, I'm not worried about, I don't think about 3-act structures. I don't give a shit when this is supposed to happen and how much character is supposed to be here or what, because it will naturally find its own level if you've done it enough, and if you read constantly, and if you love story, and you have, at least to some extent, begin to understand, because like I said, you never master it, but if you've begun to understand something about yourself, something about your own voice, it will naturally tell that story in the same way that when I was a kid, sitting out in front of, under the old tree, these trees at night, when my parents and my grandparents and my uncles and cousins were all together out there telling stories, that's what was going on. They weren't stopping and thinking, well, let me tell the 3-act structure, and at this point the character needs to do this. You know, none of that. Mm-hmm. What is this thing? Is it intriguing? What happens next? Are these people interesting to me? Why do I care what happens to this person? How does that voice sound? How does it sound? In most things that I write that are really good, the things that I think are my best, I can read them aloud very easily, and they should work aloud because they're in my voice. For better or worse, they are my methodology, my approach to the story. And I love that feeling of it, of being a storyteller. Even when I'm being experimental, nearly always I fall back to some degree on that pure old back porch, backyard kind of storytelling that I grew up with in my family. Another huge influence on me is that. Like, my father couldn't read or write. He was a great storyteller, but he didn't do it very often. He had to be in the right mood. But when he was in that mood, and I was always kind of looking for it, it was great. And then I was influenced. My mother was a great reader. She loved to read, especially, she was more of a nonfiction reader, and she supplied me with that. But she would also hand me To Kill a Mockingbird. She would hand me William Faulkner, and I'm a kid. And, you know, I read the Iliad and the Odyssey before I was 11. And when I was 11, I read Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I read comics, and I read Kipling, and I read Mark Twain, and I read Jack London. All of that stuff formed whatever voice is mine through a blender. So to me, that is the thing that connects all those different works that you said, that you mentioned, and ones that you may not be aware of, is that when I'm at my best, it's me that you recognize, even if the story is different from the other. Now, I'm not saying that I'm always achieving that, but I would say that 95% of the time, you read something of mine, you know it's me.
It's funny when we do our sort of creative and intellectual autobiographies, and people are like, oh, this has your voice, or oh, that sounds like you were mentioning your dad and your mom. I was thinking about my grandmother, my great aunt. She raised my mother, and she was from Shelbyville, North Carolina, and fifth grade education, sharecropper, picked cotton, then migrated to the north with my mother and her siblings. And my grandmother was this amazing storyteller. Yeah. And she had this story I always begged her to tell me. I'm like 5, 6, 7. And it was about this demonically possessed goat that would run past the cotton fields and chase her as a kid. And then one day, her and her friends caught the goat and put the goat in a barn. So who knows where the story came from? But I always ask her, be like, Grandmommy, is the story true? And she would say, it's true if you believe it.
Yeah, exactly.
And she just had this wonderful way of telling those stories.
Well, when I was a kid, and I read Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I read the John Carter of Mars, and of course, they're especially, those stories are just wonderful for a boy about 11 or 12, especially back then. I mean, you look at them now, they're racist, they're sexist, they've got all of the chauvinism that you can imagine.
Colonial, imperial imagination.
But they were magic as far as like the ideas. They were so, I mean, on one hand, I knew they were stories, but there was another part of me, I said, maybe these are real. Maybe there really is a John Carter, and that Burroughs is telling this story just like he says that he's telling John's story. And I would walk out and stretch out my arms to Mars, once I found out where it was in the sky, just the way John Carter did, and he was pulled to Mars by will. And that's how the story was pretty much done. He had this ability to just be pulled across time and space to Barsoom, which was the name for Mars. And I always thought, gosh, that maybe there's something to this. And I'm not the only kid that ever did that, especially boys that would go out and do that and spread our arms to Mars and want to be pulled across to some place that was strange and different and maybe in some areas, more interesting and less confining to what we were experiencing in our lives, My home life was always good. I was very fortunate. We were poor as the proverbial church mice. And like I said, my dad couldn't read or write, but he was a good mechanic, and he did that. And he had been earlier, like I said, boxing and wrestling. He'd done a lot of different things. And my mother was a salesperson. She did door-to-door sales and a variety of different things, and flower arrangement. She was a painter. So she would do paintings with her fingers and sell them, and people were buying them just as fast as she could paint them, And so, I was kind of exposed to this really good home life, but there was a confining element about where you had people that didn't understand why you read books. Why you got your nose in that old book? My dad, like I said, he couldn't read or write, but he always encouraged me because he knew how hard it had been for him, as someone who couldn't read or write. So I think that all of those kind of books were a way of escaping that narrow-mindedness around me, or racism that I would see, and sexism that I'd see. Because my mother was ahead of her time. She was a feminist before there were feminists. Now, she wasn't one of the overt ones and all that. And, and my dad was very much a racist in his rhetoric, though as a person, he was an extremely good person. But my mother was somewhat progressive. She would, for her time especially, I remember one time I went to a theater, and I'm going to the theater, and all the black people were going up the stairway, and I was looking at it, and I said, "Mama, why are those people?"
Yeah, up to the buzzard's nest.
Yeah, exactly, the buzzard's nest. And I would say, "Well, why are those people going up there?" And she said, "Well, I can't explain it, can't really say it so you'll understand it, but it's wrong, and someday it'll be different." And that stuck with me because I was a child. I mean, I was young. I was in there holding my mom's hand and seeing this, and I didn't know what was going on. And then as you get older, the worst part about it is that you get comfortable with the racism because it's part of your life back then. I mean, it wasn't uncommon because everything was segregated, and you don't think about it. Even if you're not yourself saying, "Oh, it should be this way," you just get to where you accept it. And then one day I'm thinking, why the hell is this? Why are they doing this? I don't understand this. What is wrong with this? And then all of a sudden, too, you get a little bit more knowledge, and you read Huckleberry Finn, and you realize, if you've got any fucking sense, that Twain, when he's talking about Jim, and he's talking about Huck, and he's talking about nigger and these things, he is using satire. He is using, to me, there's no more anti-racist book ever written than Huckleberry Finn. And when I read that...
And now they're trying to censor, and it's funny because, recently progressive people are trying to censor a genius book for telling the truth.
For telling the truth. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's no more foul word than nigger, and to be applied to a black person is just, it even makes me crazy, and I'm not black. It's just, but the word itself is not the problem. And then the fact that Twain was using it because that was the word of his time. But there's that great scene, and I wish I could remember the exact lines, where Huck is saying, he's got this thing where he's got an opportunity to do the right thing, and I say, quote, right, unquote, where he should return Jim back to the slavers, because that's what he's taught in church, that's the right thing, that's what he's supposed to do, that's what society expects of him, and that's what a good Christian would do. But he says, I know that's the right thing to do, but I'd just rather go to hell than turn Jim in. And so he just decides to go to hell. And if you don't catch the satire in that, then you're just an idiot. And I was a child, and even though I may not have understood it in that sort of obvious way right then, I understood it in the back of my mind that, what he's saying is that, look at all this stuff. Huck and Jim were best friends. They were best friends. And they were different age, different color, and it did not matter. And yet, Huck had been taught this certain thing that he was to believe, but it went against his obvious, not only his nature, but it went against his experience. It was not the thing that he should do because he and Jim were friends, and he and Jim had these experiences, and the fact that Jim was black and he was white didn't make those experiences any less then has it been two whites or two blacks or what have you?
It's funny, too, you mentioned, Huck and Jim, and some people who write about literature and literary theory have written volumes about the idea of Twain's work and others sort of as this model in a lot of ways for the interracial buddy narrative, and using friendships across the color line is a way of talking about race and justice and so on. But, two related questions, and that obviously leads us to Hap and Leonard, and sort of thinking about their friendship and how that story sort of developed, because those characters are real. How would you set up a story about a gay black man in Texas, his white working class best friend, having all these great adventures? So first thing is, like, was that just an epiphany? Were they two folks that you sort of knew were people you did know? And you mentioned Twain and Harper Lee and all these other authors who can broadly be described as Southern American, or Southern authors, whatever the genre is. What is your take on the whole, debate when you see a Confederate flag about heritage versus honoring folks' memories? What's your take on that in your work?
All of us that are Southerners, that are really true Southerners, and especially I think even Texans more so in a different way. Texans are a little bit more independent-minded, and not always in a positive way, and their experiences are a little different than, say, the Deep South. But East Texas, where I'm from, is the Deep South. It's not a whole lot different. I mean, our culture isn't a Western culture at all. It's a Southern culture. And when you go to the West, it's somewhat different. But I think that my experiences are exactly what I'm writing about. And when I was growing up in the 50s and the 60s, I saw racism firsthand. I mean, obviously, I never, fortunately, ever saw anybody hung or but I saw people mistreated. I saw people treated like they were animals. I saw people discussed like they were animals. I saw black men have to do things that no man should ever have to do. But and then people say, "Well, I wouldn't have done that." Oh, yes, you would have if you were smart, because you wanted to live the next day, and if you wanted to take care of your family, you had to. It didn't make you a coward; it made you a realist, and
it made you pragmatic too, as a human being.
I remember when Martin Luther King. I know I've gotten off the subject, and I'm sorry, but I remember when Martin Luther King came along and he started talking. I went, God damn, he's saying what I'm thinking. And I'm listening to him, and then there was Malcolm X, and then Muhammad Ali was a big influence on me too. My mind was already moving in that direction because of Huck Finn, and because of Harper Lee, and because of my mom too, and so many variety of different things. But then here comes along this guy saying how I'm feeling, and the 60s was a big time of change anyway, but I remember the impact that he had on my life and the disaster I felt when he was assassinated. I remember people saying when Martin Luther King Day, they got there and said, well, if they'd killed two of them niggers, we'd had 2 days off. And you're just going, oh my God, these people are fucking serious. They really can't connect the empathy. They can't connect their humanity with another person's humanity because they have been taught or have decided that somehow what they're dealing with here is an alien, subservient race, an inferior race. That's how they saw it. I remember people saying, well, I'm all for them having rights, except, of course, they can't really take care of themselves. They're just not equipped for that. And you're thinking, and I'm sitting here listening to some cracker spitting tobacco that's probably, their family probably goes hungry half the time because they spend most of their fucking life in the beer joint. So I'm looking at this sort of dichotomy of thought, and so these things, to me, impacted me deeply. So when I wrote Savage Season, which was the first Hap and Leonard, it was supposed to be a one-shot. I never had, and I wrote, and I worked with black people in the rose fields. I worked in the rose fields, potato fields, pea fields. Like I say, I never got the education, so I worked physical labor. I did all kinds of jobs, mobile home factory. So I was used to rubbing elbows with everybody, black, white, Hispanic, you name it. And so I had this different viewpoint. And so I knew people that were black and people that were white both. So when I started writing this Hap and Leonard series, Hap was me. A lot of what you get, especially in the early 2 or 3 books, are my own experiences. I mean, fortunately, I never had to kill anybody or solve a mystery.
That you want to admit to.
I want to admit to. But what I'm saying is that their backgrounds and things and attitudes. Hap Collins is me if I had not met my wife and taken, I think, a more prosperous path. And so... That to me was that, and then Leonard is a combination of many people I know, black and white actually, and I use him as a contrast. And, when I was growing up, the Southern flag, the Dixie flag, I never even associated it with racism. I didn't associate it with, I just thought it was a symbol of the South and a symbol of the North. And as I grew older, I began to realize that if I were a black person looking at that flag, I'm going to see something a little bit different. The inability to see how entwined our lives and our races are is part of what that's about. And that Southern culture and that these people talk about, a lot of times, their old daddy wasn't nothing but an asshole, would beat them with a belt, and and they've got an ancestor who fought in the Civil War. And I respect the fact that people want to have a connection to their ancestors, good or bad. I mean, I don't really give a shit that much, but they want to have a connection to their ancestors. That's okay, but not in the sense that you disregard everything they did. My dad's one of the greatest men I've ever known, but his racism I never liked, never could stand, and I've done everything I can to be just the opposite of that. You've got to see the negative as well as see the positive. And in the Civil War, not everybody in the South was fighting for slavery. They were a lot of things. I live here, they're coming down here, so I'm fighting for my place. And not everybody in the North was opposed to slavery. A lot of them didn't have any.
That's right.
They didn't want to be around black people either, a lot of them.
Well, think about the New York draft riots, for God's sake, and all these.
Absolutely. A perfect example. And think about, when a lot of the black soldiers, when they finally met soldiers that wanted to fight, they wouldn't let them because they didn't think they were as capable. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it wasn't that simple. It wasn't like the North rose up in self-righteous indignation and that the South was all, people who said, we've got to keep these people slaves. Even Robert E. Lee freed his slaves, was responsible for the first black person to go to West Point, Flipper. His last name was Flipper. Mm-hmm. And he
went through hell while he was there. Nobody talked to him. He objected to violence.
Right. I don't know if it was Clinton or Obama that finally gave him a pardon because he was accused of stuff that they know he did not do.
Yeah, because then he was served with the Buffalo Soldiers out west, and then his subordinates made up this scandal about him.
That's it. That's right. And I just wrote one of my last books about a guy who's a Buffalo Soldier and a gunfighter and a marshal, because there were lots of blacks in the West that didn't just ride on the chuck wagon and say, "I've got that dinner ready for you pretty soon, mouser." And when you saw the old movies when I was growing up and TV shows, if you saw a black person in there, they were usually a butler, or they were, a cook, or they were like the Butterfly McQueen in Gone with the Wind film. And that's what we all thought. Well, okay, that's how it was. But when you really start researching, you find out about every third or fourth cowboy was either black or Hispanic or Indian, and there was. That's right. They were doing a lot of that work. And when you think about, you watch these movies about all this Indian fighting and things like that in the frontier. And it's all these white soldiers did it. Well, the 9th and the 10th did a whole lot of that, and they were black troops.
But there's a really good book called The White Scourge, and it's about cotton in the post-Civil War era, and how you had blacks and whites on the same plantations picking cotton and working together, and that you had this sort of interracial intimacy and brotherhood as laborers. And that didn't go south, pardon the pun, until you had a situation where the white men who were working there could bring their wives and daughters. And then you saw the introduction, because of these anxieties about rape and interracial relationships. Then you saw these folk who were, working class and poor white folk working with other black people, living with them, hanging out, praying with them, drinking and partying. Then you see that sort of hostility.
That makes sense. I mean, that fits a lot of the other research that I've done, as well as the fact that I grew up in it. That's like when I've even had some young black kids that said, "Oh, it wasn't ever that bad." And I go, "Oh my son, sit down here, sit down right here. Let me tell you what I've seen." That when you forget the past, you're more likely to make the same mistakes. And it's one of the reasons that I wrote the book that I've got coming out in June called Paradise Sky, which is the black cowboy, which, there were black cowboys in the West, and there were black soldiers in the West, and there were black marshals in the West. A lot of people don't know that, like Bass Reeves and people like that were, very famous marshals, and they were black men, and he wasn't the only one. And they were in the Indian Territory, some of the roughest territories that you could have, because that's where all the escapees went. That's where they went to hide out, because the Indian Territories, as they called it back then, was kind of no man's land. And so that's where a lot of the criminals went. And these guys were marshals, and they were doing a lot of the stuff that you see Clint Eastwood and other people do in the movies, that they're portraying these kind of people. Well, where are all the movies about the black people that did that? Where are all the books about the black people who did that?
Or figures like Deadwood Dick. Well, I mean, another truly bad man.
Paradise Sky it was originally called The True Life Adventures of Deadwood Dick, and it's about him. Now, you're talking about Nat Love, and my character is Nat Love in this. Now, I don't follow the real Nat Love, absolutely, but I used him as an inspiration, and I used not only the realistic Black West, I also used the mythic West, because that's the way most of these dime novels were told. Now, no one really knows if there was a Deadwood Dick, but Nat Love always claimed he was the inspiration for it because he was the Black Rider of the Plains. But probably he wasn't. But nonetheless, in my book, he is. And I've used the mythology as well as the reality of it to do the same thing that people do with all of these old Western dime novels, which was to make them bigger than life, but yet to have a core of reality to it. I've just tried to keep the reality core larger and yet have this mythological feel in the same way that we've done with Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp and Buffalo Bill and so on. This is my passion. I've been trying to write this novel for 30 years, and when I first started writing it, I was told, well, you know what? Black people don't really read, and if you write this, white people aren't going to read it. And hell, they may have been right about white people not going to read it 30, 40 years ago. But I wanted to do this book badly, but I never could get anybody that would do it. And then as times begin to change, of course, that, the door opened, but also with my new publisher, they went, yeah, this is great. And, I wrote this book. It's the book I've wanted to write for, I guess, since 1978. And so finally I got it written. Probably best I waited, because now I've learned more, read more, and I've had more experience. But this book for me is kind of like the treat on the top of the shelf. I finally got up there and got that damn cookie I've been wanting.
And it makes you think too about, you said something about sort of craft and thinking about my own search for stories and my own sort of progress writing, nonfiction, and now trying to dabble in fiction. There's some stories you just don't know. In your heart, you don't have the maturity yet, or the craft or the ability. And you're like, you know what? I'll write that one in 20 years or 15 years after I failed, and after I've learned more, after I've gotten better at this thing.
I wasn't. I would have written it in 1978 if somebody would have bought it. It would have been different. That's for damn sure. But I always saw it as an epic, and it is an epic. And it to me, it was like a little big man with a black leader in the story, or like that's one example, or even any great epic like. Anything about the West and the opening of the West with anybody, be it a white person, brown person, black person. But I wanted to take the black experiences that I had read about, use them in the realistic form, and yet make it bigger than life, too, in the way that the old West people told stories. My father told stories like that. He was born in 1909. And he had, uncles and stuff that fought in the Civil War. He knew people that had fought Indians, presumably were part Indian. And so he knew all of those stories, but he told them in the style of the old Western hyperbole, what we used to call stretching the blanket. I don't know if you ever heard that term, but it means stretching the blanket means you're pulling that story just as far as you can without it getting too wild to rip. You get it, and you say, I'm getting something real here, and yet I'm getting something fantastic, too. I wanted a black character to have that mythological, Herculean feel that so many white heroes, or quote, heroes, unquote, depending on how you look at it, like Wild Bill Hickok or Wyatt Earp or whatever, Buffalo Bill, how they had become more than what they ever were, but yet the core of what they were is right there in those stories.
You said something really interesting there about the idea of making them larger than life. The whole thing is that the unfortunate byproduct of racism, especially Jim and Jane Crow and white supremacy in the South and the North, is that it robbed black folks of the ability to be legends, to be larger than life, to be mythics in the American imagination.
There were so many black people that were legends and that did these things and were legendary, and people don't know it. I mean, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember the man's name. I just came across it today. I was reading that the guy invented the traffic light, the three-way traffic light, was a black man. And then he invented a thing that's some of the first fire fireman's equipment that they wore to help them breathe inside a fire. But what he had to do was that he had to go around and pretend to be an Indian assistant to a white man who used his name to sell the product because they weren't going to buy it from a black man.
And that's the irrationality of racism, right? I mean, that's the madness of racism. Yeah. But I'd be amiss if I didn't ask you, as we wind down, 2 questions, because I mean, I wrote them down. I don't work from questions. We're just chatting. This is a compliment. It sounds like a backhanded compliment. But the movie Bubba Ho-Tep, that is a movie that does not, it's like a happy accident that shouldn't exist. And I remember watching that movie saying, this is one of the smartest and inside and just cool movies I've ever seen. How the hell did this get made?
Well, you know, the thing is, it's very much like the story. And when Don Coscarelli, he actually called me and wanted to come visit. You know, I never met him. He said, can I come talk to you for a few days? I said, sure. So he stayed at the house with us for, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, maybe longer. And we talked about the drive-in, actually. I think that was the one we were talking about, maybe Dead in the West, one of those two. And we you know, there was nothing I could do there. I said, you know, I really can't make a deal for these for what you want to pay me or so on and so on. But he said, well, you know, he said, okay. And he went home, and then a few weeks, a month or so later, whatever, he called me. He said, look, I read these 2 stories by you. There's Bubba Ho-Tep, and then there's Incident off the Mountain Road, and I'd like to option them. And I said, Don, man, you can't make a film out of Bubba Ho-Tep. It's absolutely crazy. I said, you know, it's just insane. And I said, to do that would require so much, and actors that would be willing to play the parts the way they are, and blah, 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 blah. And I said, you really shouldn't do this. I'm trying to talk you out of optioning this. I said, now, Incident off a Mountain Road, I think you could make a film out of that. So he said, no, I want them both. So he did. He optioned them both. And then, you know, a little bit later, he says, do you want to write the script for Bubba Ho-Tep? And I said, Don, I already told you, man, I don't think it could be done. I don't want to get mired into that. Besides, you know, you're not paying enough money. And so then he comes back and he has a script written, and he sends it to me, and I go, this is pretty good. I think it's got a few little faults, and I gave some suggestions. Some of them he might have done, some he didn't. I know that Bruce Campbell and I had some of the same suggestions, but they were a lot smarter when Bruce had them because then he was the actor. But he did it, and he got the script, and I went out, my son and I went out and watched it film, and I got to meet one of my heroes, Ossie Davis. Ossie Davis, you know, not only was an actor, he was an original black producer, director. He did Shakespeare. He was a playwright. He was a screenplay writer. He was incredibly involved in civil rights. He gave the eulogy at Martin Luther King's funeral.
Malcolm X's funeral, yeah.
But he was at both of them. He spoke at both of them.
Oh, I didn't know that. Huh.
Yes, no, he spoke at both of them. But he knew Malcolm X and he knew Martin Luther King, and he was at both of their funerals, and he gave talks at both of their funerals, or speeches at both of their funerals. He gave the eulogy at Malcolm X. But he was an amazing man, and to have him in this film, you know, meant so much to me. And because you know, it was such a crazy film, and it was dealing with age, and it was dealing, and you know, I made Jack Kennedy a black man. If he was Jack Kennedy, you never know. But he was a heroic black man, like Elvis was a heroic white man in this story, or Sebastian Haff, whoever he was. So to see this come to life was amazing to me, and for Don to pretty much just take my story, and you know, people always say, I'm going to take your story and stick it in the camera, but they rarely do. But he did pretty much. He wrote some things in it that are not in the script, and he changed a few things, most of them because of financial reasons. But that is a 98%
direct adaptation.
It is. It's amazing that what he was able to do. I just love it. But it came from the fact that my brother, who's 17 years older than me, lived in Memphis, and he recorded at Sun Records unsuccessfully, or tried to record at Sun Records, which is where Elvis recorded, which is where John Cash recorded, which is where Jerry Lee Lewis recorded. And plus, all of these black artists, when they made race records, a lot of people don't remember what a race record is, but you got Muddy Waters, you got all of these people who were recording
Screaming Jay Hawkins.
Yeah, oh yeah, he was incredible. I got a spell on you. But anyway, they got all this stuff at Sun Records, and my brother was there, and he married his current wife, my sister-in-law, Mary, graduated high school with Elvis. So there was this connection that was there. And so I had always loved Elvis's music, still do. I'm a big Elvis Presley fan.
And Elvis has really gotten a bad deal, too, about being a racist. I mean, a lot of folks, it's a whole separate conversation. He wasn't. And there was like a whole really interesting article I was reading that basically traces the origin of that myth to this enterprising African-American, I think it was African-American journalist who wanted to, basically get attention and distorted the facts, messed up, mistranscribed interviews, did all sorts of stuff to fundamentally distort Elvis's legacy.
Yeah, it really did, because Elvis learned a lot of what he did from black artists. What people don't understand now, because they're used to hearing, different people sing different ways and whatever, but when Elvis first came out, he sounded like a black man to a lot of people. So what they did is that when he was interviewed by Dewey Phillips in Memphis, he said, "Oh, and yeah, what high school do you go to? What high school did you graduate from?" Of course, he knew that as soon as Elvis said that, they know it was a white high school, you see, because they didn't want people to think he was black because he sounded black.
Yep.
So, I mean, there was a racism going on there, too. But Elvis himself, he was constantly, learning from black performers. He praised black performers. He had the Sweet Temptations who sang with him all the time.
That's
and
right.
there may have been a little bit more action going on there between Elvis and the Temptations.
Yeah, and they have that iconic photo of Elvis riding in the Cadillac with them in the background, riding with him.
Yeah.
And all these pictures of Elvis with all these black musicians. And, folks who follow my writing know, one of my mottos is you don't need to make stuff up. Real life is interesting enough. You don't need to make something up about Elvis to make a point.
Yeah. He may have had his problems, but that one I don't believe was one of them. But anyway, that movie to me was an amazement because he followed it. But anyway, because of that, and my mother had been in a rest home because of an accident she had, a car accident. And so I spent a lot of time at the rest home. So with that and with the Elvis connection, of course, when I was a kid, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That was a big impact on me. So all of these things that were interest of mine were swirling around, and I had this title in my mind called Bubba Ho-Tep about a mummy, and I had no idea what I was going to do with it. But when somebody asked me, said, "We're doing this anthology of Elvis stories called Dead Elvis," is what it was originally called. And I don't think that's what it finally was called, but at that time it was. And there was also at that time this big mythology going around that Elvis wasn't dead and people were seeing him at the 7-Eleven or blah, blah, blah. So what I did is that all of that just swirled together, and I wrote that thing in 2 weeks as fast as I could go, turned it in, thought about it, and said, I have just written the biggest turd that has ever been written. I'm going to withdraw that. And so the day I decided to withdraw it, I got a letter back from him and said, "Man, this is the best damn story in the anthology. I love this." And I went and reread it, and I thought, "Oh, this is a lot different than I thought. This is a lot better than I thought." Because all of those things that I was thinking about, old age and my mother being sick and the way these old people were forgotten and thrown away, you could go down there and get the best damn stories in the world from listening to these people talk. And yet, they were considered passé. If you weren't 30 years old or 40 years old, then what worse were you? And so all of those feelings that I had and all those things that were bothering me found their way into this story. And at the same time, I wanted to use this framework of these old sort of Roger Corman type films, and so it would be kind of oddly accessible to more than one group, and that when people who just expected a mummy story got into it, that they might in fact get something different than they expected. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've had people say, "Yeah, I saw that movie when I was 14, and then I read the story when I was 14 that says, I thought I was wanting this kick-ass Bruce Campbell movie, and in the story I thought there was more of that, and then now here I am, I'm 25, and all of a sudden I really get this story. I know what it's about." And that's the kind of story I wanted to write that seemed like over the top, crazy as shit, but at its core, it was trying to discuss something important. And I've always thought my best work is like that. Sometimes I'm just being entertaining. Sometimes I'm just building that chair.
Yeah, my mother is a private nurse. As a child, worked as a teenager actually in a rest home, and she has a story how, number one, about the dignity of elderly people, and how she and her friend, her best friend, how they would go and hide linen in clean sheets so that the patients who were there, the people there who were being paid for by the state, could have clean clothes and have a clean place to sleep. And that's why I've always gravitated to the wisdom of our elders. I mean, like you said, all those stories, no one wants to hear them. All that wisdom.
Everything's got to be right now, Everything's got to be new. Everything's got to be right now. It's got to be happening right now. And it's why, and the point I was going to make about entertainment, though, is I said, I can just be entertaining, But to me, Kafka is entertaining. To me, some of the most difficult writers in the world sometimes, if they interest me, they entertain me. So entertainment to me isn't just tap dancing and playing the bugle, you know. It can be the most profound thing in the world and be entertaining. Entertainment is, you know, when people just say, I just want to be entertaining, then that always bothers me, because that's sort of like I haven't got the skill, or I haven't got the craft, or do I have the concern to give you my best. But what I meant by that when I said it was that sometimes you know that the story has nothing but, you know, the obvious entertainment value. But when you do something else, like I like to think Bubba Ho-Tep, and I actually like to think Hap and Leonard to some degree, also are telling you something about race relations. They're telling you something about culture. They're playing with politics. They're doing all these sort of things that a lot of times people would tell me, oh man, you don't want to do that. I mean, you're saying bad things about religion, and you're dealing with racism, and you're shitting on the flag of the Dixie flag, or, you know, whatever it was. And I thought, you know, why would I want to write if all I'm going to write is the same fucking thing over and over?
All the time.
Yeah.
I mean, in Bubba Ho-Tep, you know, is about also, like you pointed out, is about human dignity and about friendship. And also Hap and Leonard, you know, is winding down, as I said, you know, one final question, because I have to ask this question. I said, the one thing I have to ask, I'm going to have to go for it. So like you said, with Hap and Leonard, thinking also, too, about, you know, culture, friendship, masculinity, notions of honor. There's so much going on. So here's my obligatory question I promised myself, because I'm actually thinking about, I'm going to write an article about Cold in July, the movie. So it's rare that you actually get to talk to somebody who's written the story upon which a movie is based. And you can tell me if I'm crazy and insane in terms of my interpretation of the film. So you have that license, please. So Cold in July, and if folks haven't seen it, I have it on Blu-ray, I've seen it many times, saw it in the theater, is a great, great, great film, period. And it's really criminal that it didn't get the attention it deserved, because it deserved, you know, a much wider run and distribution. But Cold in July, so without giving away all the plot points and the surprises and the twists. So on one level, it's a Western, and it's also sort of like a noir story, but at its heart, as I read it, it's really about sort of, you know, bad men. And your main character is sort of like this man who's, you know, involved in sort of, you know, nuclear family and normal life and domesticity, and his own curiosity brings him to an understanding of violence in the world outside of him and manhood that he didn't have before. So it's sort of cautionary, but it's also about sort of initiating people into this other world that's right in front of us. So am I crazy?
No, you're very right. There are some other elements, though. Is that the big element is that it's about fathers and sons, and
that's right, fathers and sons.
You know, the guy wants to be a good father. He's got what he considers to be failings, which really are not. They're just the natural things that people have raising children. And then he meets a guy who, in the book, is far more, and it's in the film, but it's far more explanatory in the book. And is that he meets this guy Russell, who threatens his son. I'll say that much. But he begins to see this guy as a father figure, because he reminds him of his own father who committed suicide. And then you come along with Jim Bob, who is sort of like a know-it-all father or uncle figure, and then they're introducing him into this masculinity, this role of masculinity, this deal of honor. But there's also, at heart, too, is another theme there that not a lot of people get, is that you know, and at the very first of the novel, I use that Nietzsche quote about looking into the abyss too long, and then it looks back. And so when he does all these things, he's changed. Now, it's not all good. He's done something. He's put down a worse group than the people that they deal with are worse than they are. But they, by doing it, are changed. Now, these other two guys are already changed to some extent, because you know they've been through some other stuff. But the main character now has seen something dark and felt something dark, and he has been in life and death situations. How do you go back to being a parent every day?
And having a normal 9 to 5 and doing the sort of the mundane things of suburban life.
Yeah, I don't know if you read the book or not.
I'm about to. Yeah, I don't want to give it away.
Well, yeah, the book is far more. I love the film, by the way. I want to say that right off. I love that film. You know, it's on Showtime right now, and it was, you know, it was the highest they ever had, second highest I think they ever had on video on demand at the time for IFC. And we did well overseas, and it's done well on DVD. It didn't get, as you said, the sort of theatrical release in the larger way that it should have, and we've all been disappointed with that. But it actually did quite well, and is still doing quite well, though it should have done better. But if you read the book, you're also going to get you're going to see the wife that's in the film there, but you're going to get a totally different side to her, and you're going to find a much brighter, hardened-headed woman who is also part of what is going on, at least to some degree in the book. And I think, and also my Russell, Sam Shepard was wonderful as Russell. My Russell, he's a talker. He's a talker. He's not just being a silent guy. But in film, sometimes you take the elements of that character and you have to put them in 90 minutes. And so there were a lot of changes, and I understood why they did 98% of them. There were 2 or 3% in there. I'd go, hey, I like more of my dialogue. I like this. I like that. But I was a producer on that film. They showed me the scripts. I loved most of the scripts they did. I made some suggestions. I didn't see the last script they did, and I think that's partly because they didn't want to hear anything at that point. They were ready to shoot.
It's done. It's in the can.
Yeah, you know what? I'm with them on that. I think at that point, enough is enough. Now, there's a Hap and Leonard television series coming out, and
now, yeah, tell folks about that, because that was going to be, sort of the what are you doing next, what's upcoming, where to find you question. So tell everybody about the TV show.
Well, Jim Mickle, who directed Cold in July, and Nick D'Amici, who co-wrote it with him, they're also friends of mine. Nick actually appears in Cold in July as the lieutenant, the law officer, the sheriff's office guy. But they are writing it, and I'm a co-executive producer with Lowell Northrop. And there's several other, producers, including Jim and Linda Moran and others, Nick Shoemaker and blah, 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 a bunch of people. They try to give you the list here, go on forever. But the thing is, it's supposed to film this summer and come out next year. They're right now trying to cast. They're working on that, and we're hoping that we, can get everybody that fits the roles correctly. And they're going to use 6 episodes. They're going to shoot the first book, Savage Season, although they're going to borrow elements from some of the other books to set it up for those particular books if the series goes beyond one season, which I obviously hope it does. And I'll tell you what, I've read the first 2 scripts. I put in my 2 cents on them. They've listened to most of what I've had to say very kindly. I like the scripts they've got. I'm very excited about the series. I think it's going to be really, really good. Any of these things depends on how the actors relate to the material, depends on so many factors that are beyond anybody's control. But right now, my guess is it's going to be better than Cold in July. It's going to be a really good series. And we're hoping that maybe we can go back and get Don Johnson to come back as Jim Bob, because he appears in the Hap and Leonard novels, in 2 or 3 of them. Sundance Channel will be doing it, and my guess is it'll probably be sometime next year, because it's going to take them the summer to film it, and then of course after that there's post-production. I'm excited about it, and I should mention here, I can't not mention this. Going back to Cold in July, there are actually the soundtrack, that wonderful sort of Carpenter soundtrack, but there's also, my daughter has 2 songs in that because she's a professional singer, and she wrote 2 of the songs. And when they're in the Mexican restaurant, you can hear Back on My Smile, which she wrote when she was 18, so that's one of her older songs. And then when they're in the store, there's Foolin' Around's playing. You can't hear that one as well. Back on My Smile is the song that you're hearing while they're in the Mexican restaurant. And so, she was involved in that too. So it was kind of a family affair. And if you look closely, I'm in the film. I'm the preacher in the background when Sam's character, as Ben Russell, first shows up to speak with Michael.
Oh, wow. You are. No. There you are. I was thinking about that too.
Yeah, so I'm in the background back there. So I just a little family affair, that's really, really good. So that was fun. I'm excited about this series. Also, Bill Paxton is supposed to direct The Bottoms this year, which is considered by many people to be my best book. I think it's one of my best books, if all goes well. And then Peter Dinklage and I are doing a cooperative to put together my novel, The Thicket, which he would star in.
That's right. I was smiling and thinking, obviously, we know the role he'll be cast in, but I was just smiling listening to you. Your voice is infectious, and the happiness. Like, when you think about all the stuff you've done, and you were talking about your daughter, do you just smile?
I do. The same way. I just, I'm 63, and I just feel like I'm getting started. I think I've written 3 of my best novels back to back, and that was The Edge of Dark Water, The Thicket, and this forthcoming Paradise Sky. Plus, I've written a new Hap and Leonard. In some ways, you can't consider that best of because it's such a part of what's already gone before. It's almost like a giant novel that is yet to be finished because it's a series of events, But the novels like Edge of Dark Water, The Thicket, and Paradise Sky, I think are 3 of the best books I've ever written, and I'm so proud of them. and I'm like I said, I'm 63, and I'm doing all kinds of exciting things, and my kids are doing exciting things. My daughter, besides John Cash's son, is her producer, and he's won a couple of Grammys for his work in country music, and she does kind of a country blues music, and she recorded Johnny Cash's Cabin and stuff like. So there's a lot of great things in her life, which makes me feel good. My son, he's a dispatcher in town. He's got a degree in journalism. He's worked in newspapers. He's writing comic books. So my kids are just doing terrific. My wife and I are doing terrific. Mainly, if my family's doing good, everything else comes after that. The career comes after that. I've talked to people said, they went off and I left my wife and my child because, I figured art comes first. And I thought, well, you big moron, you absolute fucking idiot. Your family always comes first, and you're a better writer for it. So to me, I'm happy because my family is doing well. My career is doing well. I've been one of those odd ones who didn't just do it all at the front, and then the rest of it was the dregs. It's just built every year.
That's just some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful wisdom. And as I said, the positive energy, as I said, is so exciting and inspiring. Where can folk find you online if they want to reach out to you? Your website, email, all that good stuff, Twitter?
Well, I have a website at www.joerlansdale, as you would expect. Plus, I have a fan page on Facebook, and I'm very active on that page. I give writers tips, at least things that work for me. I'm not suggesting that they're perfect for everybody else, but I do that. I always am promoting my books on there because that's what it's for. And I promote short stories and films and things related to me and my daughter's work, my son's work when he has comics and things out. And I'm always, answering. I try to respond to everybody. I'm not always able to, but I certainly read everybody's comments. And so you can find me on that fan page or on that website that I said before, www.joerlansdale. And I'm pretty much out there everywhere. You can go to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and buy my books there. They're certainly available.
Wonderful. Mr. Joe Lansdale, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. As I said, I learned a lot, and it's just always through the wonders of the Internet and technologies like we're in the future. You can send an email to someone whose work you admire and appreciate, and then within a week or two actually talk to them. So this is a wonderful experience, and I want to thank you.
It's been good for me, too. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for some smart questions and let me run my mouth.
Oh, no. This is, as I said, my policy here on the Chauncey DeVega Show is I shut my mouth and listen. When you've got somebody who's got a lot to teach, you let them talk, and you learn a lot. So I appreciate it on your end.
Wasn't that a lot of fun? I rarely listen to the conversations here. I'm being real. Once I record something and edit it, I rarely re-listen to a conversation here on the Chauncey DeVega Show. I look forward and I'm back. And man, that was a lot of fun. And one of the things I've been thinking about is I didn't realize that was going to be an inspirational conversation, to talk to somebody whose work you admire, who has such good concrete advice, who tells you the ups and the downs, who can you just talk honestly about. And that's why I think the whole thing about the color line mystifies me. We talk about race and the black freedom struggle and white folk, black folk, brown folk. This is a shared American experience. And when folk can talk honestly about shared love and shared interest and talk about justice and speak truth to power, and I love how Mr. Lansdale talked about his upcoming work on the old quote-unquote West. And you know what? Black folk were there. Brown folk were there. Our Asian and First Nations brothers and sisters were there. And when you tackle that mythology, you see that again, as I always say, the truth is more interesting than the fiction. Always. I can't wait to read his new work on the one and only Deadwood Dick. And I was joking on Twitter. I said, that may be my new cosplay outfit. I'm going to come out there as Deadwood Dick / Nat Love. And folks want to know who the hell I am. That'll be a whole wink wink, because the C2E2 Worldcon nerd set, the cosplayers love having esoteric knowledge. They're going to be coming up to me and be like, who the hell are you? And I'll be like, you know what? There are some folk you have no idea about who are making history, who are larger than life. So that was just one of the great high points of the conversation. I just want to thank Joe Lansdale one more time. And he's going to be on again. We didn't talk about martial arts. We didn't talk about his work on animation. We didn't talk about his graphic novels. He is prolific, he is efficient, and he takes care of business. And that was also fun, too, to talk about Elvis Presley. They just, on PBS here in Chicago, I don't know if it was nationwide, for the Pledge Drive, had a really cool special. Elvis from Hawaii, from Honolulu, and I'm a huge Elvis fan, and people hate on me for that. I think Elvis is one of the greatest entertainers of all time, period, bar none, and he gets a real bum rap for how folks hate on him in regards to the lie that he stole black music. That's simply not the case. And if you do any research about Elvis, you'll see all the love he got from black entertainers, from the R&B tradition, from the soul tradition, from the country tradition, who just gave him nothing but love. So R.I.P. Elvis, you were one of the best and the greatest. And another side story, if I ever get to make that money from Powerball and make a film about my life, we'll talk about one of my friends from college who was a professional Elvis impersonator. I kid you not. He was the real deal. And now he's a music promoter and he does stuff with Scott Music. So nothing but love out to him. So the Oscars are coming up. And I will not make a full list of predictions because that would be tedious. What I will say is I hope that Birdman wins because Birdman, for my money, I've seen most of the movies, was the best movie of the year. I will say something that is impolitic about Selma. I think Selma is the very definition of a Hollywood movie. I love the cinematography. I love the lighting. See the movie. It's a wonderful movie. And if you were to sit down and say, here's how you make an Oscar movie. Historical figure, beautiful lighting, beautiful cinematography, great acting, great music. Something that resonates with the cultural and political moment. So in terms of police brutality, Ferguson, Eric Gardner, Selma, man. Selma had it down. Groundbreaking in the sense of the nomination. You have a sister being nominated as director. But here's the problem. And it's not a problem, it's a good thing. I don't think Selma was the best movie. So I think Selma was a self-consciously Oscar-esque movie. But think about it in terms of a cooking competition. And I love to watch the Food Network. It's food porn. So think about it this way. So you have two finalists. One who quite literally makes a classic dish in the way that a classic dish should be made. They should win. But what happens when they come up against somebody who throws the rule book out, takes the basic fundamentals of good cooking, improvises around it, and swings for the fences? Well, that person's probably going to win. And that's what happens. So for me, Birdman is it. It's a self-conscious film. It's self-consciously reflective about Hollywood. It's a movie about a fallen Hollywood star remaking themselves. Stunning performances. There's a moment in the movie where I actually teared up, where we have one of the characters talking about relationships and life. And it's one of those things that just hits you, where she says, I'm paraphrasing now about the scene, it's about a divorce and relationship, where she says to her ex that she wasn't upset about his behavior, it was that she lost her self-respect in terms of putting up with his behavior. And trust me, I have been in a situation where I can totally relate to that, so that caused me to tear up. And just the beauty of the movie. It's so surreal, it's self-conscious. Debord, the French philosopher, would love it in terms of thinking about spectacle. It's between Boyhood and it's between Birdman. I hope Birdman takes it. So what will I be doing? I will be sitting here in my bunker in Chicago, where it will be very cold, maybe even snowy, making my stew. I have been working on my beef Sauvignon. I have been working on my beef Sauvignon for years. My flavor sac is aroused and sensitive. I'll let you do that visual. And here's my quick and dirty beef Sauvignon recipe. Improvise around it. I do some things that have changed. I do some things that are different from the classic recipe. Hey, man, I'm a working class black man. My daddy was a janitor, musician. My mama was a private nurse. I improvise. I'm all for flavor. So I keep some of the classic things and throw some others out. So email me at ChaunceyDeVega.com, Chauncey DeVega Show. We are Respectable Negroes, WARN, with your suggestions about my recipe or stuff that you think that you will be eating. Or if you hate my recipe, yell at me. I love this recipe because it's a classic. And Julia Child and others have said, man, if you can make beef bourguignon and kill it consistently, that's your test. It's this deceptively simple, rustic dish that so many things can go wrong with. And you just want to keep messing with it and messing with it and messing with it. You get your beef stew meat. I like to go to the butcher or go to Whole Foods or somewhere where they actually cut the meat up and say, leave me some fat. Or people laugh. I say, go to the quote unquote working class, ghetto underclass supermarket where they got that chuck. They got that stew meat cut up with the extra fat. Did not get the extra lean. I just the flavor. It's all about the fat. You get that bad boy and you get some bacon. And if you can't get the bacon scraps, you get some bacon to cut up. If that's not an option, get some peanut oil if you can, or if you had to, canola oil. But trust me, that bacon is so good, and you render down that bacon, you cook it down, and you get all that oil, that grease, that flavor out there, and you brown the meat in that. And you want to get a good sear on either side. There's a fancy chemical name for that because you know it's going to be cooking for hours and hours. But you want that sear, and of course, salt and pepper. But I don't like to put pepper on it because pepper burns at high heat. So I go for the Lowry's because you can't go wrong with Lowry's, and some garlic powder. Woo! Man, that's a 1-2 punch, baby. That's Rosario on one side and Halle Berry on the other. And you sear, you take it out. Use a heavy cast iron pot, or If you have to, use your best skillet if you got it. Now you take that bad boy out and you clean out, if you choose to. Now get the paper towel. You can clean it out, or you can leave it in that wonderful oil that comes out. And you save that bacon because you're going to be snacking on that bacon for this Oscar meal. So you take that bad boy out. Now what I do that's a little different is I add my vegetables and my mushrooms in 2 phases. That's just my innovation because it's going to cook down. And you want to still have that flavor, so you add it in again. And this dish, cook it and you get it ready, just leave it alone. And you monitor. So you're going to have a bottle of Cabernet, red wine. Don't get the $3 bottle. Don't do it, because it's going to be nasty. Spend the $10, $8 to $10. That's just enough. And don't drink it. Don't be drinking on that bottle. So now you brown the meat down. You take your heavy crock pot, or if you're going to cook it on the stove top, something that's big enough, but not too big. You don't want to use the thing you cook pasta in because you're not going to be able to fill it up. You want to make sure that everything is covered up. So now the next step is, and I don't put flour on that beef. That muddles the flavor. You take that beef aside, you let it rest. You put it away. Don't touch it. It's going to be tough. Don't play with it. Don't get frustrated. As long as it's got that brown, you're good to go. Next step, you want to have a white onion. Some use yellow. I like white, a big white onion. You cut that white onion up. You get the skin off. You cut it. Get a clove of garlic. 1 whole clove. Leave the skin on. Smash it. Cut it up because we're going rustic here. We don't have to be fancy. You're also going to need a little tomato paste or ketchup if you need it. Ketchup is fine. Just a little tablespoon of ketchup. We do this to flavor, to personal taste. You will need A1 sauce, Worcestershire sauce. That's what you're going to need. You're going to need your salt, your pepper, your Lowry's, your onion powder, garlic powder, black pepper. Those are all the good things you're going to need. So now you put the beef aside. So now you're going to sweat. That's what we the fancy term. You sweat it using some corn oil or olive oil, but olive oil may smoke. You're going to sweat that garlic, a little of the garlic, not all of it, a little. And some of them onions. Get a little of that water out. You're going to put that aside. You're going to need some celery and some carrots now. Do not use potato. I think that potato muddles the flavor of our Super Bowl meal. No potatoes. No potatoes. You will need beef stock, not beef soup that you strain or beef bouillon. Beef stock. Stock is what you're going to look for, not broth, although you can fake it. And you will need some beef bouillon cubes. I know it's going to cost you about $20, but trust me, it's worth it. You're going to need some egg noodles. So now you got the beef. Now you've sweated the onion and a little of the garlic. You can keep some of them bulbs too with the skin on. You're going to go and fill up that crock pot or that stew pot or whatever you're using with that beef broth. You are going to add in the beef. You're going to do 1 part to 1 part beef stock to that red wine. Don't be drinking it because I know you want to drink it because you're excited about the Oscars. Part to part. You will also add another ingredient. You're going to add in some mushrooms. I say the white button mushrooms or portobellos or the little portobellos. You can have them, you can cut them, whatever, because we're practical. Half of the pound that you bought, you're going to need a pound. Half of the big onion you're going to put in there because we're going to double it up. Now you're going to add some Worcestershire. You're going to add some barbecue. I didn't mention that before because that has tomato sauce. You're going to add a little tomato sauce from that ketchup or tomato paste. This is our Oscar meal now. We're letting stuff happen. Now you're going to add the celery and the carrot. You don't have to, I guess you could. Take the skin off the carrot. You don't need to do that. You don't really need to do that. If you want to be brave, next time get 2 carrots and add 1 later. Or get 2 celery stalks and add another 1 later. Now you got the mix. You season it to taste using your salt, your pepper. If you want to put some extra Lowry's, that's not my thing, but you could do it. And you heat it up with the beef in there. Don't let it boil. You just want to get a little flavor taste. Because remember now, the flavors will concentrate as you cook them. They're going to cook down. You're going to need patience. You're going to put this in an oven that's preheated. Keep in mind now, preheated to about 325, maybe 300, but 325 is good. You're going to cook this bad boy 4 to 5 hours. Now, again, you're going to want to open the oven. You're going to want to lift the top off the pot and make sure that your pot that you are using, don't put something in with plastic on it, please. Get something that is old-fashioned, that's heavy iron. I use my iron skillet. I got a nice heavy iron pot. I put some aluminum foil on that bad boy. That works good. But whatever you put in there, make sure it's ready for the heat. We don't want your food melting. Get mixed with metal and poisons. We don't need that. Have a fire. You'll email me, Chauncey. I'm trying to watch the Oscars, and you start a fire. Now, the 325, 300, you don't want any bubbles. No bubbles in your stew, in your beef sauvignon. You hear me hitting this because it's a big deal. You are not boiling. You are simmering. Take your time. Take your time. A few hours will go by. Wonderful stew, that mix of wine and beef stock and garlic and A1 and Worcestershire and tomato paste and barbecue sauce and beef and onions and mushrooms and celery and carrots. That's going to cook down. Now you're going to look at it about 2-3 hours now. Once it's cooked down half, and you can taste it periodically. I know it's hard not to. You're going to have to. You're going to get your heavy gloves on or whatever you use, your oven mitt, get that bad boy out. Don't burn yourself. Now, here's where we go to the bridge too far. You got to be careful. We are going to go and stir that bad boy up with a wooden spoon. Nothing, don't use anything metal, just wood. A good wooden spoon or plastic. If it's something that's really expensive, you don't want that plastic bleeding in there, just use a nice wooden spoon. It helps you with the flavor. Now you're going to go again. A lot of what you cooked is going to have disappeared. It's just going to be now the carrot and some of the mushrooms and the beef will remain. Now, I have, after much practice, decided I'm not going to use a strainer because some folks say take it out. And you want that beef at the end of 6 hours will be so tender, you can take that stew meat with a spoon and it'll fall apart. You'll be able to push through it with a spoon. You are then going to go and add the remainder of that wine. You're going to add more mushrooms. You're going to add more onions. You're going to add, if you want to, another carrot or celery. You don't have to. So basically, we're adding back in all the things that have disappeared for that final 3 hours. Keep it low, and then it's just going to keep bubbling and bubbling and bubbling. Boy, knock you out. So now you will have shown the patience, and don't be worried. The other thing we're going to add, as we're cooking that last 3 hours, and you can add it early and replace it, but I like to add it at the end, trial and error here, and if you get some cheesecloth, or even some twine and soak it in water, you take that and you hear me scratching. That's my goatee. I'm scratching my goatee for flavor. When I start talking about food and good TV and Oscars, I scratch my goatee for my thinking phase. You will have a nice bit of rosemary. Get some sprigs of rosemary, some thyme. Now, and even a little tarragon. And our friend, the superpower here, bay leaf. We will add some bay leaf in there, 1 or 2. And all that goodness the last 3 hours, that's adding more flavor. And I'm telling you, it's going to be good. It's going to make your house smell good. The dogs and the cats are going to be walking around. If you got a lover, a partner at home, they're going to want to be picking in there. Don't let them touch that food. Now, at the end of the 3 hours, you will have seen things will have bubbled. You will be monitoring it. It will have cooked down from the top about 3/4. Be careful. You don't want everything to evaporate. You'll know what I'm talking about when you see it. And that meat will be so tender. And another little trick, if you're brave, is add a beef bouillon cube, both in the beginning and after it cooks down. We're double flavoring, double seasoning here, and it's all to taste. So once you get into this recipe, you'll learn what works for you. Then the coup de grace. I don't know if it's a coup de grace, maybe there's a better word. Piece de resistance. The French folk do this. You get a tablespoon of flour, white flour, and an equivalent part of butter. Nice. Then you take that tablespoon, cut off about 1/2 inch of that butter, put it in a cup, and then heat it up in a microwave. I know that's not right. Heat it up somehow, and you fold it into itself. Keep folding, keep folding. You add that in, later on, another step, into that beef stew. And that will give you a nice flavor, a nice sort of silky consistency. And I'm telling you, that beef and flour is it. That is it. So now at this point, you should have all that goodness together. You will then want to fish out, if you so choose. You certainly want to get the rosemary and the thyme and the other seasonings out of there that you have bundled together, because you don't want that falling apart. As I said, you can go to the fancy cooking store at the supermarket and get some cheesecloth, I believe they call it, and wrap it up so it's all flavor. It won't make a mess. Get that out of there. I believe in leaving the celery and carrot in. Some take it out. I choose not to. The traditional recipe would, at this point, you would put everything in there. You would let it sit. You put it in the refrigerator after it's cooled, and the next day the flavors will have condensed. You'll skim off the fat. I don't do that because I like that fat. I like that flavor. Now we need some starch. So you put that in the oven, 225 in the warming, so it stays warm. You don't want your fluid boiling off. And if you have a little wine left, put that in at the end. There's no rules to this. We're layering flavors. So I also like to have this with a key lime tart or a fresh fruit tart. You can have a gelato, I guess, or a lemon Italian ice, whatever works for you. There are no rules here on Chauncey DeVega's Oscar meal. I'm so excited because we talked to Joe Lansdale and I'm talking about the Oscars. So I'm just giving you one of my secret recipes. So now we get the egg noodles out. Go to your supermarket. Egg noodles are great, $2. You get that boiling water going. Some salt. Do not put oil in. They're my pet peeves. Do not put oil in boiling water for egg noodles or pasta because nothing will stick to it. I don't know why they do this on the TV. So at this point, you boil them egg noodles, a rolling boil with the salt, cook them halfway, about 3 minutes. You want to have another skillet, and you want to put them in there with butter. Trust me, that butter is your friend. And then you want to cook them for the remaining 3 minutes. Medium heat, you don't want the butter to burn. And you toss them egg noodles in there, and you add some lemon pepper. Now, you can mix it up now with Italian seasoning, and you can put some Italian seasoning, if you want, in the stew. Be careful with that because it has a tendency to burn. So now you got all this goodness. You drain them egg noodles. You got the beef sauvignon with the A1, which you can add even more to, with the Worcestershire if you need it, with the other seasonings if you need it, but be light with your hand because remember, everything you add concentrates. And of course, you have some garlic bread. And I would say get a ginger beer or ginger ale or a lemon lime soda. Man, you ready? Trust me, you ready. But let me tell you, you ain't going to be making no love later on in the night. You're going to be sleeping or you're going to be relaxing in other ways. And as a soda, here's another nice thing. If you don't want that soda, rather, a nice beer would be a Hogarten beer. There you go. You got $25. You got enough eaten for 2 to 3 days if you make enough. And trust me, it is out of sight, that fresh rosemary and that meat. So that is the first and probably only recipe I will share here on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. Whew, I get going. I can't stop. So the next podcast here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, I hinted at this in terms of how to find us now. We're on Stitcher and we're also on iTunes. So just go to your Google friend, type that in. It will show up. Stitcher allows you to listen on your smartphone. So that's really neat. And the audio quality is good. I heard it wasn't, but it sounds fine to me. iTunes is obligatory. It took forever to get it approved. I don't know why, but now we're there. So please share, tweet, Facebook, tell folk, subscribe to the iTunes feed for ChaunceyDeVega.com because the more people listening means more folk we can get on the show. So I really would like you all to do that. I know folks are listening to the show and I greatly appreciate it. So please do that and tell your friends because I think we got something really cool. A critical mass is building up here for the podcast. Next episode, season 3, will be with the great band William Pilgrim and the All Grows Up. I talked to these brothers, last year. I do these ahead of time. I talk to folk whenever I can, and they are cool people, great musicians. They're going places. I don't put anybody, and I don't sit down and waste my time talking to folk who are not interesting and smart people doing interesting and smart things that we can all learn from. We got to have the knowledge and the entertainment. And as I said, pop music is such a vacuous, empty terrain right now, and we're always yearning for the past of Public Enemy and hip-hop, or KRS-One, or talking about the good old days in the 60s when artists were saying something, or NWA, even sort of embracing their nihilistic truth-telling and pedagogy. And I can't wait to see their new movie. But trust me, William Pilgrim and All Grows Up, man. These guys are going somewhere. We talk about climate change. We talk about music. We talk about the obligation of the artist. We talk about their lives and how they met. Just a wonderful human interest story, how two folks could meet through the wonders of technology. In this case, I think Craigslist. Get together and make great music. And I just love talking to them. It's a really wonderful, fun interview. So that will be next week. So, as is my habit, I want to thank our guest for this podcast, the one and only Mr. Joe Lansdale, Bubba Ho-Tep and Cold and July fame. I want to thank William Pilgrim and the All Grows Up, the folks I'm talking to next week. I want to thank all of you for listening, tweeting, and sharing the podcast. And now, as I said, we're on iTunes and Twitcher, YouTube, ChaunceyDeVega.com. And of course, you can directly download the show, which is always awesome. So I greatly appreciate folks who do that. And tell people. And as again, I want to thank all of you for listening and just for pushing us forward and all the great opportunities that your positive energy has created. And as I always say, we have no advertising here. It's all word of mouth. It's a twice-a-year fundraiser. I do not accept commercials. I have been offered opportunities for advertisements, and I have said no, and I will continue to do that, barring some great unforeseen event or amazing opportunity, and I will share that. But hey, if you can, go to ChaunceyDeVega.com on the right-hand sidebar. If you like what we're doing, if you got a penny, tax return day is coming up. If you got some tax money back and you want to give us $5 and say, hey, I like the Chauncey DeVega Show. I like ChaunceyDeVega.com. I like the fact that this brother is truth-telling with posts that go viral because he dares to say things that other people are afraid to say. Show me some love, and I greatly appreciate that. So as is my habit, be well, treat each other well, treat your family well, treat your four-legged friends well. And in this cold, please try to show some love to our homeless brothers and sisters. It is hard out there. And to our homeless animal friends. It is just really, really hard and dangerous out there. So until next time, be well, treat yourself well, treat someone else well who may be a stranger, call a friend who you've not talked to in some time, and give somebody a hug and send some positive energy out into the universe. Until next time, be well.